doing the things we were doing? Why were we building them up? Why were we cultivating the hatred and hostility for Russia? And where did this man Zelensky come from? Remember, Zelensky was an unknown comedian of questionable value who shows up out of nowhere and he becomes the head of state. And remember, he ran on a platform that told the Ukrainians, we want peace with Russia. We have to find a way forward that's peaceful. He was elected overwhelmingly on that platform. Wow. Then he did a 180 and turned into the most, vicious Russian hater and warlike individual they've ever had. The funny thing about Zelensky is that when he was elected, he could not speak a word of Ukrainian. Oh, wow. He grew up speaking only Russian. That was an embarrassment to our State Department, as I learned when I spent some time there. And they worked hard for several months to bring him up to speed. It's not that Ukrainian and Russian are so different that in a few months one can't master the other. But nevertheless, stop and think about that. But he had a huge support from the Ukrainian people, which tells you the masses of Ukrainians want nothing to do with the war against Russia. But this was then brought on. And I think what happened is that the so-called neocon globalists in the Beltway, who are all the various think tanks, thought that Russia could be bullied. And they kept saying, oh, they won't do anything. Putin won't do anything. I was interviewed by Dmitry Simes in January of last year. And I was asked point blank, do you think Russia will go in? I said, absolutely. This is a huge danger to Russian national security. They're not going to sit there. The reason they went into Crimea was not just because historically it had been Russian. They didn't want it to become a NATO naval base in the Black Sea. I mean, there are reasons why actions were taken. So this was foreseeable, but people in Washington miscalculated. And then when Putin went in and essentially moved very carefully and cautiously with a goal of minimizing destruction of human life and property, because he did not want a war with the Ukrainian people. Everyone said, oh, well, look at him. Look at the Russians. They're incompetent. They didn't do what we did in Iraq. They did not destroy virtually anything that did not move and then try to attack anything that did. In other words, there was no shock and awe. Well, of course not. That's not what he wanted. And it took several months for him, sadly, and his colleagues in Moscow to figure out there's nobody to talk to. They're not going to negotiate with us. And so we go into this new setting where he says we've got to go onto a war footing. We're going to have to expand the armed forces. We're going to have to build it up. And then we're going to have to go into an economy of force mode for months until we're ready to strike back. Well, that's what's happened. And the sad part is that all of it was avoidable. It was never necessary. And remember that Mr. Burns, who is the former ambassador to the Soviet or to Russia under, I guess, Obama, he was the one that wrote the memorandum that said no means niet, or niet means no. In other words, don't expand any further, don't go into Ukraine. And subsequently, he was sent within the last few months to try and hammer out a deal. And that's understandable why he would. Ukraine is falling apart. They are the ones who've taken horrific casualties. They are now dragging 16-year-old boys into the armed forces at gunpoint. They are still taking heavy casualties, and 75% of their casualties have been from artillery systems, strike systems such as rocket artillery, missiles, aviation, and artillery, all of those together, 75% of their casualties. And millions of people are being destroyed by this.
Yeah, it's been very interesting to watch the mainstream media because I cover the news, and so I have to at least see what they're doing, but then get these underground reports from you and from other people, Scott Ritter and others, and really see what's going on. I remember early in the war, I said to my YouTube community, I have no military background, but it seems like Putin is slow walking this invasion in order to get people to flee so that he's not causing mass casualty. And yet the mainstream media perceive that as Putin's weak, but he's also crazy. He's lost his mind. He's this new Hitler. And we were totally being fed a bunch of BS. And now we're saying, okay, wait a minute, this thing's actually going to fall. But now we're sending in tanks and everyone's smoking the hopium that these tanks are going to be the new savior of Ukraine. I know you have, intel and opinions on the tank situation. What's really going on with the tanks that are going to be sent to Ukraine?
Well, I think the administration pulled off a brilliant scam in order to trap the Germans into supporting something they didn't want to support. And that was by saying, okay, we'll send tanks. And then we said, we're going to send 31. But then we added, they'll have to be built from scratch. We can't send the ones that we have because of various technologies involved in these tanks that we don't want to fall into the hands of the Russians. So we have to build a model that we can safely send to Ukraine so that in the event the tank is destroyed or is captured, we're not putting at risk sensitive technologies and capabilities. So now we're looking at tanks arriving in 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. And then the usual suspects on the Army side are saying, well, we'll have to build up an entire logistical infrastructure and network. Well, that's true. But that's something that people should have thought about before they launched this war. There was nothing in Ukraine to support anything beyond the first few weeks. So those tanks aren't coming anytime soon. Meanwhile, the Germans are now saying, oh, we can't send our best tanks either. We'll have to send old Leopards. We'll let our allies who have some Leopards send them if they like. They can do that. We give permission. But we're only going to send, I think the latest count from the Germans was 14. But then they assumed that all the other Europeans that have Leopard tanks would send those. And they said that'll bring your total to 88 or 2 battalions. Doesn't look like, with the exception of the Poles, the rest of them are going to give up their Leopard tanks. So I think, frankly, it's much ado about nothing. And again, anyone who looks at what's happened in Ukraine understands that warfare has changed rather profoundly. Warfare is not going to be dominated by armor on the ground as it once was. What dominates warfare today is something I've been writing about for 30 years off and on, and that is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance linked to strike systems, rocket artillery, missiles, conventional artillery. That's what's dominating the battlefield. That's what's lethal. Now, sometimes it comes in the form of a small handheld weapon system, but most of the damage is really done by much larger, more powerful precision-guided munitions and missiles. The Russians understand this. They were the first to recognize this back in the 1970s. This is now being employed. So if you send armor anywhere without substantial air defense support to try and defeat these missile threats from drones, from terminally guided systems, whatever, you're not going to have tanks for very long. You could watch 88 tanks vaporize in a few minutes. And at the same time, your infantry has to be there in the form of armored fighting vehicles with lots of firepower and, again, lots of overhead protection. Top attack from ISR strike dominates the battlefield now. Precision has made it extremely lethal. And that's why, if you look at the Russians, excuse me, they are moving very deliberately, very slowly, advancing under the umbrella of this ISR strike. They don't have to make any mad dashes to Kiev or across the river to hold something and wait for reinforcements. They have effectively created steamrollers. The steamroller is supported by this top attack system, the ISR strike complex, the overhead surveillance. And it's working very effectively. It's protecting their forces and absolutely devastating the enemy. And then as they need to, they move forward their armored force on the ground and their direct fire capabilities with the infantry and the armor, and they annihilate whatever is left after they've disrupted, disintegrated, atomized, do whatever words you want, the front. That front in southern Ukraine is crumbling. It's falling apart. It's almost completely destroyed at this point. And how many casualties the Ukrainians have had is anybody's guess. I've heard from 157,000 dead up to over 200,000 dead. I've heard 400,000 casualties. I've heard 500,000 casualties. No one is telling the truth in the West. The only way you can find these things out is by talking to people on the ground. Ukrainians, Russians, and Poles are very helpful, and they will tell you the truth. And the American people haven't been told the truth, and they don't understand that we are not in a position to go to war with anyone today. We're not. We don't have munitions factories, armaments factories turning out equipment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Russians do. Their factories are humming. There's no shortage of anything. In fact, what they've done recently, according to the most recent reports I've seen, is that they've walked back from some of the major overhead strikes. They have the capacity to fire 60,000 rounds a day, including rockets and missiles at the Ukrainians. 60,000 rounds. But they've been walking that back, and the Ukrainians who are watching this, and the Poles and others are saying the Russians are husbanding these for the coming offensive. And this offensive is coming. There are 700,000 troops all the way around Ukraine. Of that number, probably 250 to 300,000 are combat forces. In other words, the people that actually go forward and kill the enemy. They're going to move. And when they move, this steamroller will go forward as I've described. And they will annihilate what is left. And it doesn't make any difference what you send to the Ukrainians. They can't be trained fast enough. There are not enough of them left anymore that can do anything. If you're starting to drag 16-year-old boys off the street, away from their families, into uniform, what kind of a situation do you think you confront? It's terrible. And it's not necessary. We've done this to the Ukrainians. This nation is almost destroyed. There are between 18 and 22 million Ukrainians left in the territory that Zelensky and his friends in Kyiv control. More than 10 million have left the country. 4 million are Russians living under Russian administration and are quite happy about it in the East. And then you have the casualties. And then you have 2 million that were already in the West working in the EU and Great Britain. And the sum at the beginning was never more than about 37.4 million. So this whole thing is a catastrophe. We're killing the Ukrainian nation. We're killing the Ukrainian state. And this is not something that was inevitable. But we were not willing to consider neutrality for Ukraine.
Yeah.
And yet we have decades of experience with neutrality in Austria that worked very well. When Austria finally secured neutrality, Eisenhower, who then was president, was greatly relieved. He kept saying, we don't have the forces to protect all these countries. Let's make as many of them neutral as possible. He wanted to neutralize Poland. He wanted to neutralize many of these states that are now part of NATO. He said, we can't defend them. We can't defend them now, Stephen. We can't.
Yeah. Final question. I know how busy you are. Thank you. This has been, I've learned at least a dozen new things, and I read a lot. So thank you for your wisdom. Is Washington, D.C. and NATO going to pull us into World War III? Are they going to trigger Belarus teaming up with Putin and coming in from the north? Are we going to be pushing Poland and Germany in? Or is this thing going to find resolution once Ukraine can no longer sustain itself and the money stops pouring in? Where do you see this going at this moment?
Well, the senior military leaders in the Pentagon know that we are not prepared for a military confrontation with Russia in Eastern Europe. They understand that. Remember, we are predominantly an aerospace and maritime power. We're prepared to defeat anyone who threatens the United States. Ideally, we'd like to meet our enemies somewhere in the mid-Atlantic or in the mid-Pacific, not on the Eurasian continent. Our army is pitifully small and pitifully incapable for what we would want it to do. It needs to be larger and more capable, but we've been destroying the armed forces now for a long time with all sorts of terrible policies that undermine discipline, cohesion, and destroy good leadership. So I think that we can avoid this confrontation. And I think there's a predisposition to do that. I think the amateurs in the White House recognize privately that they're in a lot of trouble. They've pushed this too far. And they're going to be embarrassed badly as they watch the steamroller eliminate what's left of the Ukrainian armed forces.
From what I'm seeing outside of CNN and other mainstream media, is it seems like It's the politicians in Washington, D.C. that are more eager to fight this battle through Ukraine against Putin. And it doesn't seem as if the Pentagon is as on board as the politicians. Who's really behind wanting this war?
Well, I think it's clear that the American people are largely divorced from the reality of this conflict, as they have been for the last 30 years, divorced from all the conflicts. War has always been something that happened far away on somebody else's soil. The difference this time is that Washington has decided, along with help and assistance, particularly from its allies in London and the global financial community run out of New York City, to wage war on the Russian state, with the goal of not simply regime change, but ultimately destroying the state, potentially dismembering it. And when you look at the people who are advocates for this terrible, destructive policy, they are largely the same people that got us into the Balkans in the 1990s, into Bosnia and Kosovo, and then subsequently were largely supportive of the interventions in 2001 and 3. Perpetual warfare in the Middle East, demonizing and transforming into an enemy Libya, Syria, and obviously Iran. This is an old story. It's the same old trope that you've been hearing. It's 1936 again. We have another potential Hitlerian state, and if we don't act, we are appeasers, and the world as we know it will end. So that's about it. But I think there's a lot of money behind this, because Russia is full of trillions of dollars of resources, mineral resources, oil, gas, precious metals, agricultural. We just go down the list. There was an attempt in the 90s and in the early part of this century by people from the West, many of whom are connected to organizations like Goldman Sachs and the global financial community, to go in and effectively rape Russia and steal everything they possibly could from it. They were ultimately defeated and thrown out by Vladimir Putin, who established a new regime to bring some more stability and dignity back to the Russian state. He has been talking now for many, many years about the unacceptable policy of advancing NATO to Russia's borders. And he's been warning over and over and over again, if you do this, you will inevitably come into conflict with us. We will not tolerate a large NATO presence. And when you say NATO presence, read the potential for U.S. ballistic and cruise missiles and so forth on the border. And we've taken the position in Washington, that is the political elite, the ruling elite of our country, that Russia is weak, that Russia can be bullied, and all we have to do is apply great pressure. And since we dominate the global financial system, we can isolate it. And this ruling political elite embraces most of both parties. And so we are embarked upon this very dangerous course of conflict and confrontation now with the Russian state and its armed forces. The Washington community that sponsors this has obviously enriched itself over the last 30 plus years through all the various interventions and the massive increases in defense spending. But it actually goes beyond that. It goes to the reconstruction costs, rebuilding costs, and the introduction of U.S. firms and interests into other countries. It's a kind of new imperialism that we've been embarked upon. And Russia is simply the latest target. The problem for the ruling elites in Washington is twofold. First of all, most of them are ignorant of reality. They know nothing about the world beyond our borders. They know nothing about military power. And so they badly miscalculated with Russia. This was a war that should have ended in a few weeks because Russia would collapse, or at least in a few months because Russia would collapse. This is a war that should have ended because Russia can't produce enough ammunition. This is a war that should have ended because of horrendous and horrific casualties taken exclusively by the Russians. And all we have to do is arm this Proxy, this Ukrainian force that we built after 2014, once we had established a government in Kiev that would do our bidding, and this force in Ukraine would devastate Russia. Well, it hasn't quite worked out that way, has it? So now we face a very different set of circumstances. But when you ask who is behind it, you've got to look at a whole range of people. And remember that the preeminent goal in Washington for most politicians is to stay in office and continue to enrich themselves. Therefore, they pay a great deal of attention to their donors. Who are the donors? You have to go and look at the oligarchic class of people that drive policy, that keep us in a state of perpetual conflict with a whole range of people and nations. Who are they? Then look at the industries in which they are invested and which support these policies. When you look at those things carefully, in other words, it boils down very simply to follow the money. When you do that, you begin to understand that what's happening in Washington has nothing to do with the American people or United States interests. No one in the United States, or very few people in the United States, know where Ukraine is. They could care less. And when you ask about NATO, people will say, "Oh yeah, sure, that's important, I guess." What is it? This is the problem with just about everything, I think, that's been happening in the United States since the end of the Second World War. Most Americans aren't terribly interested on what goes on beyond the borders of their own country. I mean, frankly, most of what happens around the world on any given day doesn't make much difference to us. So you've got a ruling class that says, no, we want to be engaged everywhere because it's beneficial. That ruling class is diverse, but again, it embraces both sides of the political spectrum. That's why if you're expecting a Republican-controlled House to suddenly dramatically, shift into reverse gear and stop something, you're very much mistaken. Most of them will vote with the left, just as most of the left will vote with them. Why? To keep the money flowing. It benefits them because it benefits their donors, the Russians, just as we do. They have the same capability to monitor what happens from 100,000 feet in space that we do. They can read the names on gravestones, and if they want to monitor the conversations in the White House, they can do it. All right? Why are we worried about this flimsy balloon that is too small to carry a significant payload? It can't even communicate with China. It's on the wrong side of the world. The only way it could communicate is to send data to satellites. Meanwhile, our border is open. Thousands of Chinese, thousands of Russians, and others from all over the world have been pouring in. Where are they? What are they doing? Are our nuclear power stations secure? What about these people? Are they near any of our military installations? How many of them are agents? How many Chinese scientists and engineers are working in our laboratories? This is all nonsense, what we're hearing about the stupid balloon. They're missing the point. Washington needs to be held accountable for its incalculable negligence and mendacity. I agree with that. But you're not going to get anything out of the balloon. You need to turn to the really substantive issues. Why are our borders open? Why do we have 100,000 troops in Europe, including almost 50,000 in Poland, and none on our borders? There's no threat to Europe from Russia. Russia is not interested in invading Europe. This is all nonsense. This was cooked up for years to try and demonize Putin and turn him again into another Hitler figure. It's the same old trope. It's the same people doing these things over and over and over again. At some point, the American people need to become engaged and put an end to it. That's the easiest way I can put it.
Yeah. So do you think this spy balloon is to then embarrass President Biden right before the State of the Union? Or because they started saying, oh, well, they came in with Trump, but now we can't prove it. And national intelligence didn't ever communicate this to that president. Is this just a giant distraction for the American people so they don't actually look at what's happening within our own borders or at our border?
Well, I think so. Undoubtedly, you have the usual suspects on the right who will grasp at anything to attack Biden. But the truth is that if you want to go after Biden, you've got lots of reasons to do it that have nothing to do with the weather balloon. But for some reason, a lot of people on the Hill, I don't think they understand what you and I just discussed. They don't understand the Chinese satellite array. They don't understand that the Chinese from space can track every surface combatant in the United States Navy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And any U.S. surface warship that comes within 200 nautical miles, that location data can be turned into targeting data that results instantly in the launch of missiles to sink it. Now, that's serious. That's a real threat. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to go to war, but it's something we should be aware of. listening to congressmen and senators talk, you'd think they knew absolutely nothing about the true state of affairs. We can't recruit for our armed forces. People say the volunteer force is imploding. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. Has anybody raised that with Biden? And today, I think it's the CEO of Bank of America is worried about default. And you have Janice Yellen running around as the Secretary of the Treasury saying, well, we could default. We must not default. We've never defaulted. Well, first of all, we have defaulted. We defaulted in 32 and 34. We just called it restructuring the debt. We defaulted in 1971 when we went off the gold standard because we could not cope with the enormous debt being amassed as a result of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty and the war in Vietnam. So we've been down this road before. Nobody wants to admit those things. So we run around and say, we have to pay our debts. We have to pay our debts. We have to pay our debts. You've got CEOs now saying, how are we going to do that? How is it possible? Nobody's telling the truth about the bond market. You've got to look at everything, the holistic picture. Any normal population with representatives who actually cared about the United States would be addressing these matters and ultimately be arguing for the removal of this president and his administration for incompetence and mendacity. There's no rule of law in our cities anymore. How much criminality do you want in the United States? How much is acceptable? Apparently, we've decided a certain amount of criminality is now acceptable. Yet it's the rule of law in the United States that underpins our economy, has made us great and powerful. And what about all the jobs and the industries that have been shipped overseas? Have they come back? Is there any effort to bring them back? What are we doing? Americans need to wake up. Forget the balloon. These are serious issues. We got a State of the Union address tonight. What's he going to talk about? Nothing. It'll be another exercise in happy talk because everybody in Washington has figured out that happy talk is the real opium of the people.
Yeah, they got us smoking hopium. We're all just living on hope. Okay, going back to power and Biden.
We started talking about Georgia and Ukraine, states that actually border Russia. And he said, no, we're not going to tolerate this. And he told us that if we insisted upon this, they would take action to secure their borders. Now, understand that in Ukraine, we spent a lot of money over the last 10 years. You got to go back to 2014 and look at the coup that brings to power a government that was not duly elected. That government was picked, cultivated, developed, and ultimately led by people from Washington. Victoria Nuland is the most, well-known figure, but she's hardly the only one. And working together with people in the State Department and the same individuals that I mentioned before who were part of the interventions in the Balkans and Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and so forth, all of those people are part of this cabal bringing this war to fruition. Now, in truth, as I said before, they miscalculated. I don't think they believed, frankly speaking, that Putin was going to do what he did. Even in December of 2021, when he said, look, I'm willing to talk, but there's certain things you cannot do. We will not accept Ukrainian membership. Ukraine can become neutral. We can talk about that. But I will not tolerate a NATO membership for Ukraine. It poses a threat to us. And of course, we said, oh, well, that's ridiculous. We don't threaten Russia. Well, if you look at Ukraine now, you look at the force we built, you look at all the biolabs we've established in that place, which I think is another issue that deserves closer scrutiny than it's gotten. You begin to say, well, if we had no malicious intent, well, your viewers naturally have seen the president state initially what he would not send, and then subsequently backtrack down the line and say, I will send it. I think that we're seeing this happen again with fourth generation aircraft, the F-16. The truth of the matter is the reason he keeps backtracking is that things in Ukraine get worse. Ukrainians are losing more soldiers. Their infrastructure is being destroyed. They're in very bad shape. And so under the circumstances, which you refused to send previously, you now send as a matter of desperation. The problem with the F-16 is twofold. First of all, I don't know how many people they're going to find to fly this anytime soon. Now, what has always concerned me and should concern Americans is the predisposition to put American pilots into those aircraft and fly them in support of the Ukrainians. Now, undoubtedly, that would be a question of calling for volunteers or bringing someone who's recently retired back to do it. The problem with that is that these are then mercenaries, and they are not covered under the Geneva Convention. In other words, they're simply fighters for hire. And that's a serious problem. What do you do if you lose one of these aircraft? And then finally, I think as things get worse, and they're very bad now, and they're only going to get worse, we're back to the temptation to find ways to intervene in Western Ukraine. As it becomes clear this Ukrainian state apparatus is collapsing. And remember, we own it. We pay for everything. We own the government. We're keeping the economy going. We're paying the troops, the bureaucrats, everything. So once that weakens, I mean, the whole thing is going to fall like a house of cards. So I worry that someone will say, well, let's go in. You know, with our own forces, the Russians wouldn't dare to challenge us. And of course, they're wrong. I think for many Russians who are extremely angry with us and the terrible damage that we have caused them by turning Ukraine into this platform for attack against Russia, they would welcome the opportunity to crush any U.S. forces that intervened, or for that matter, any NATO forces that did. So I hope we put that out of our minds, but I worry about that.
Would that be like a coalition of nations, or specifically like Poland, or who do you think might make a move? And could they justify, like Poland, saying, hey, this used to be our territory anyway, we're kind of just taking it back now that Ukraine can't stand on its own two legs?
Well, you know, everybody in Eastern Europe can make that assertion and have some credibility. I mean, if you go to this thing they call Kaliningrad, which is the very corner of East Prussia, that was German from about 1220 onwards. So you're talking, what, 850 years nonstop German. It's now part of Russia, thanks to FDR. Stalin, as his armies moved west, said, hey, you know, we'd really like to have that port in the Baltic. Do you have any objections? And FDR said, no, of course not, Joe, take it. You know, so now we have Russians sitting there where no one in their right mind wanted them. But the bottom line is that, sure, you can always find the Hungarians, the Poles, any numbers of people that have controlled territory that's now under somebody else's authority. So that's part of it. But I think the bigger issue is this. Whenever we go anywhere, we always go as a quote unquote coalition. We have that as the fig leaf of legitimacy. But the truth is that other than the Poles, maybe some Romanians, although I have my doubts, and maybe a few Brits, the United States is going to be on its own if it goes into Western Ukraine. Now, it could be some of the Lithuanians want to go along. I don't know. That could be. But even in Poland, the enthusiasm for this fiasco is waning. The most recent polling data says that the Poles are tired of being overwhelmed by Ukrainian refugees. They're openly talking about the Ukrainianization of their country, which they dislike intensely. And the Polish chief of staff has said, look, the Russians are not incompetent. They're tough soldiers. They're very competent. They know what they're doing. So I see evidence that people are sobering up. The question is, will we sober up? And I don't see any evidence for it. Just as you have people that absolutely refuse in Washington to believe that there could be a serious economic turndown. In other words, that there is a cost associated with money printing and tightening credit and rising interest rates. You can also find lots of people in Washington say, oh, you know, the Russians are nothing. We're everything. We're invincible, invulnerable. It's very dangerous. So I see that here. I don't know how deeply that runs, but, you know, if you looked at some of the more recent articles that have come out, there's a lot of evidence that what I would call common sense and reality, those things don't really intrude very much at the highest levels of the Biden administration.
Yeah. Well, if Europe doesn't make a move, we sure know that Wall Street is going to make a move. BlackRock is already meeting with Zelensky and talking about how they can, revitalize, bring life back, and how there's just so much money to be made. And I find it disgusting how, they look at this as just such a great money-making opportunity when there's human life on the line.
Well, remember the people that you're talking about here in Washington, or the financiers in Europe and the United States, whether it's Soros or Larry Fink at BlackRock, they're not interested in Ukrainians. They could care less. They have been very hopeful that Russia could be destroyed so that they could strip Russia of its resources. Remember, you're talking about an area from sort of the middle of Ukraine all the way to Kamchatka, the peninsula, that is full of extraordinary resources. Everything from gold mines to extraordinarily rare minerals and rare earths and endless quantities of fresh water, wonderful soil, an abundance of food. We could go on and on and on. So I think that's really been behind much of what we see in this sort of proxy war waged against Russia. Now, I don't see any evidence that Russia is going to collapse, and I think Putin will probably be president long after Biden has vanished from the scene. But it's still dangerous, and we'll have to see what happens to the rest of Ukraine. But you've just hit on a very important point that all the people viewing this should keep in mind. If you're a Russian right now and you look at the situation, you've taken, contrary to what the mainstream media says, comparatively few casualties. I mean, you have an exchange rate of about 1 Russian killed for every 7 Ukrainians killed. So that's a pretty favorable ratio. Nobody likes to lose anybody in war, but that's a good position to be in. Just as Ukraine is now scraping the bottom of the barrel, running out of manpower, they're actually dragging back about 30 to 35,000 Ukrainians training in Germany, Canada, the United States, the Czech Republic, other places, back to Ukraine to become the foundation for this so-called counteroffensive that they want to, execute. And the rest of them, though, unfortunately, are just being shanghaied into the military. You're talking about a lot of young boys, a lot of old men, and so forth. Russia's in a different position. Russia's stronger than ever. Russia is actually peaking in its capability. If you look at its forces, they've really learned a great deal over the last year plus. In other words, if we look at the initial Russian forces that went in, like any army that has not seen action for a very long time, they made mistakes. But they learned from those mistakes. And there's a great report out from the Royal United Services Institute. It still has stupid things in it about the Russians lacking initiative and all that, but brush that aside and just look at what they talk about in terms of adaptation and innovation. And you see that the Russians have really produced a very, very fine force. And they're better now than they've ever been, and they're larger now than they've ever been, and they have more modern equipment, more experience. So when they are finally released and allowed to execute, and I think they're waiting for the Ukrainians to expel, sort of exhaust the last forces at their disposal on another pointless counterattack. Once that happens, they're in the driver's seat. So why would they sit idly by and allow us to intervene, or even worse, bother to negotiate with us? The Politico article that came out over the weekend said that behind the scenes in Washington, the Biden administration, White House, State Department, people are now talking about a frozen conflict as the best outcome. Now think about that. These are people in Washington who want to turn Ukraine into Korea, create a DMZ, and of course then they want to park their forces in Western Ukraine on the other side of the Dnieper River, staring at the Russians. Or better yet, if the Russians would accept such a thing, they'll cross the river up in northern Ukraine and sit there. Russians will never accept that. It's out of the question. They have been fighting to demilitarize Ukraine, eliminate the armed forces there that threaten them, and then secondly, they want this place to be neutral. So the idea that these people at the top could look forward to some sort of Korea-like division of Ukraine and that they might be satisfied with that is a manifestation of how utterly uninformed and ridiculous they are. It just makes no sense. They're not listening to the Russians. They're not acknowledging reality.
Well, they're still trying to push this narrative that this was an unprovoked attack versus a decade of building up and provoking Putin to the point where he felt like my only option is to create this buffer zone And unfortunately, Ukraine has to become that buffer zone. Let's move on to Bakhmut for a minute. Russia says Bakhmut has fallen. Zelensky says, no, it hasn't. We still have soldiers in the area fighting. And until we run out of bodies, this area is not taken. How does the battle for Bakhmut show how military strategies and goals can change over time? And in your opinion, has Bakhmut fallen into the hands of Russia?
Well, Bakhmut, 90% of it has been in Russian hands now for months. It's only this small sliver of land on the very edge that remained in Ukrainian hands. And they occupied some concrete reinforced buildings, very large, sort of high-rise-like buildings. And the Russians were very reluctant to destroy them because they had information that there were Russian civilians in the basements. We have to understand that you're operating in a part of Ukraine where the population is really Russian. Now, they may have been Ukrainian citizens, but of course, Ukrainians treated them badly, didn't allow them to speak their language, have their schools, worship as they saw fit. They did not have equal rights before the law. They were an oppressed minority. And every time someone that was Russian would complain, look, I'm a Ukrainian citizen. I'm happy to do whatever. Just give me my equal rights. They said, well, there's a country. It's called Russia. You can leave here and go there. So the Russians did not want to kill large numbers of Russian civilians in eastern Ukraine. That slows everything down. It has slowed everything down from the beginning. People don't get it. That's been a major constraint on the conduct of Russian military operations. Secondly, they then saw virtue in necessity to some extent. Remember, Surovikin comes in. He's from the aerospace forces. He takes over the theater in the fall, completely changes the chain of command, streamlines it, creates unity of command. And he decides that as long as the Russians are building up their forces for future operations against Ukrainians, that he's going to run now what I would call a relatively elastic defense, an economy of force operation. In other words, to use minimal force to maintain control of the areas that the Russians have, while at the same time enticing the Ukrainians in to fight, inviting them in essentially to attack. Bakhmut suddenly became very attractive to him. We now know from what Mr. Prigozhin has said and other Russian sources have said that he deliberately used Bakhmut as sort of a red flag for the Ukrainian bull and kept those roads open and the opportunity for Ukrainians to reinforce it. Now, we see a lot of evidence that upwards of 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in and around Bakhmut. That's a huge number of people. We know at least that many were wounded. The bad news with a lot of the Ukrainian wounded is that they never returned to duty. So the Russians have been pretty good at getting somewhere around 70 to 80% of their soldiers back to the front lines after a couple of months of recuperation. Ukrainians have been unable to do that for a whole range of reasons. So the losses were really staggering. And I think it is not an exaggeration to suggest that Bakhmut really is the graveyard of the Ukrainian army. And Zelensky's obsession with Bakhmut is on par with Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad. And what people don't understand is that the Germans didn't have to have or occupy or control Stalingrad. Long before the Sixth Army even arrived on the Volga River, the only thing of value in Stalingrad was an aircraft factory, a place where the Russians were literally building fighters. That was destroyed by the German Air Force. There was really no reason to, overreach with your forces and go that far east. But then Hitler did it. He was sort of attracted to this. Well, it's called Stalingrad. So this is a kind of strategic grudge match with Stalin. And Stalin, said, we're not leaving Stalingrad, and fed more and more and more troops in there. Of course, the difference was that he could afford 1 million casualties. The Germans could not. So the bottom line is Zelensky has treated Bakhmut in the same way. It becomes the symbol of Ukrainian resistance. And I think we are probably equally guilty of encouraging him to do that. And instead of being a symbol of resistance, it was just a sponge for blood. And that's why, I think in retrospect, 2, 3, 4 years from now, people will look back on this war and they will say, well, Bakhmut was a huge turning point because the Ukrainians couldn't replace their losses. They couldn't replace all the equipment losses. And the